Inside a stormy congressional hearing in Washington, D.C., Senator Britt and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett clash over one burning issue. Should public welfare be expanded to protect struggling families, or is it fueling national dependence? Katie argues with fire and conviction, painting a picture of broken incentives and wasted money. But just minutes later, Jasmine shifts the entire narrative, unveiling stories, faces, and hidden truths that no one in that room was prepared to confront. When the system punishes the poor and rewards the powerful, who really deserves to be on trial? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the blinding lights of the House Oversight Chamber, the chairman leaned forward, his gavel gripped like a weapon of finality. 3 deliberate strikes silenced the murmurs, snapping every camera and eye to full attention. This hearing, he announced, voice resonating through wood-paneled walls, is convened to address the proposed expansion of the federal welfare budget, a plan met with fierce resistance by several members of this body. The air turned electric. Screens around the room displayed stark charts, a 12% increase in housing assistance, expanded Medicaid eligibility, and emergency food security grants. "We are not just debating dollars," the chairman said coldly. "We are deciding whether the poor in America deserve to live with dignity or with delay." That's when she arrived. Britt stepped into the hearing like a prosecutor walking into a sentencing. Her blazer was crisp, her posture militant. She moved straight to the microphone, didn't wait for permission. "Let's be clear," she said, her southern drawl edged with steel. "We cannot and will not print money to feed dependency." The sentence dropped like a gavel of its own. Gasps rippled. Some on her side smirked. Others scribbled notes furiously. But across from her sat Jasmine Crockett, unmoved in full silence. Not from weakness, but from calculation. Her hands rested on a thick stack of files. Real paper, not numbers. Eviction notices, pharmacy receipts, letters from desperate parents and dying patients. Her eyes met Britt's. She didn't speak, not yet. But in that moment, surrounded by data, judgment, and double standards, Jasmine sat like a fuse waiting to ignite, and then, with a coolness that only years of political rehearsal could perfect, Britt leaned forward and let the data do her dirty work. The room dimmed in mood, though the lights stayed bright. She clicked her remote. A towering digital chart exploded onto the screen behind her, red bars stretching ominously upward. "Let's deal in facts," she began, voice like ice over steel. "In just 5 years, federal spending on entitlement programs, food assistance, Medicaid, public housing, has surged by 34%. Her tone was measured, but beneath its calm lived condemnation. She turned slightly, letting the numbers loom behind her like a wall no one had permission to question. "We are spending more now than at any point in the past 2 decades, she continued. "Not because we're solving poverty, but because we're institutionalizing it." A ripple of discomfort passed through the chamber. Jasmine didn't move, but the tremor was real, and Katie knew it. She pivoted, flipping to a specific page in her binder. The movement slow, theatrical, like peeling back a curtain. "Let me give you a name," she said, holding up a file with large black redactions and bold stamped dates. "This woman, 32 years old, no job, no attempt at job training, 5 years on federal support. She receives housing assistance, SNAP benefits, and full Medicaid coverage." Britt's voice dropped just slightly, enough to inject scorn beneath the surface. "And yet, no community service, no educational progress, no record of seeking employment. Nothing. Zero." She closed the file with a sharp thud and looked up. Her next sentence was not shouted. It didn't have to be. It came slow and cruel. "This system doesn't inspire growth. It rewards stagnation. It pays people to give up." A chill fell over the room, like a shadow cast by an invisible hand. The statement didn't explode. It lingered sour and heavy, like smoke in the lungs. Some nodded. Others looked down. But Jasmine Crockett stayed still, her expression unchanged. Not out of shock, but because she'd heard this narrative before, weaponized like clockwork. She saw the game. Reduce an entire nation of strugglers to one decontextualized example. Pretend a single mother's pain was policy abuse. Pretend suffering was laziness. Her silence now was no retreat. It was restraint. Because buried in her binder, in the pages still untouched, were names Katie wouldn't dare say, stories she wouldn't dare confront. And Jasmine knew, the deeper the wound, the quieter the burn, until it erupts. But silence has limits. And in a room filled with polished suits, scripted outrage, and cold statistics, Jasmine Crockett had no intention of remaining quiet any longer. She rose with measured stillness, not the kind that fades into the background, but the kind that demands a room to stop breathing. Her hands were steady as she moved toward the screen. She didn't look at Katie Britt. She didn't need to. This wasn't a rebuttal, it was a reckoning. "I've heard enough about dependency," she said, her voice low and composed, but edged like a blade. "Now let's talk about survival." She opened her binder, thick with stories and documents. Not charts, not theories, but the kind of evidence that bleeds. "I want to introduce you to someone who isn't a statistic. She's a citizen, a wife, a worker, a woman your policies have forgotten." The screen behind her blinked to life. A dimly lit photograph appeared, grainy, unfiltered, raw. It showed an elderly black woman sitting at a reception desk, her hands folded over a yellow notepad, her back slightly hunched from decades of labor. She wore a faded motel uniform. A plastic name tag hung loosely from her collar. May Turner. Her eyes looked tired, but not broken, the kind of eyes that had seen too much and kept going anyway. Jasmine let the image linger. "This is May," she said. "She's 72 years old. She works the night shift at a roadside motel in South Dallas. 5 nights a week, from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., she checks in guests, changes sheets when housekeeping doesn't show up, and empties trash cans to avoid calling maintenance." The screen shifted to a scanned copy of a pay stub. Jasmine didn't need to read it. She had memorized it. "She makes $873 a month. That's before taxes, before she pays for bus fare, before she buys food, before she buys insure for her husband, who's been paralyzed since his second stroke 3 years ago." She turned the page in her binder, her hands slow and deliberate. "Now let's talk about why she's still working. Because the man she loves, the man she married 48 years ago, needs 6 different prescriptions a month just to keep breathing." The next slide was not a chart. It was a scanned image of a single pharmacy receipt. $2,173.46 typed in bold at the bottom. Several lines of medications filled the page. The screen paused there. No music, no motion, just the stark reality of what survival costs in America. $2,173.46, Jasmine repeated. "That's what it takes each month to keep him alive. Not to heal him, not to improve his condition, just to hold off the end." She looked up. She applied for Medicaid because no insurance company would touch a man over 70 with 2 strokes and a lifetime of poverty behind him. Jasmine walked back to the microphone, eyes scanning the faces in front of her. She was denied. She let the words hang in the air, heavy and bitter. Denied because her income was $60 over the threshold. A beat, no movement, no breath. She flipped to the final page. The denial letter. It was projected behind her, the words "income exceeds state limit," underlined in red. $60, she said again, this time slower, as if repeating it might force someone, anyone, to process the absurdity of what they'd heard. "Let me put this plainly," she continued. "May earns less in a month than most of you spend on valet parking. She hasn't taken a vacation in 15 years. She doesn't own a car. She walks 5 blocks to the bus every day. And yet this government, our government, told her she makes too much to deserve help." Jasmine's voice rose slightly, but it wasn't anger. It was grief sharpened into precision. "She works while watching the man she loves slowly disappear. And we call that self-reliance." The room was paralyzed, as if frozen in a collective state of disbelief. Aides lowered their pens. Reporters stared at their laptops, fingers hovering but not typing. No one looked at Jasmine directly. Not yet. because the moment demanded more than acknowledgement. It demanded guilt. Jasmine stepped forward, her voice quieter now, but more dangerous than ever. "Do you know what May told me?" she asked, her tone dropping to almost a whisper. "She said, I thought if I worked hard, they'd help me when I got old. But I guess I didn't get old the right way." Jasmine paused, let that settle. What is the right way to be poor in America? Quiet, invisible, grateful for crumbs? She turned to the committee. Her gaze moved from chair to chair like crosshairs. What part of this equation says she's safe? What line item says she's not poor? She walked back to the center of the hearing room, binder still in hand. This is what happens when we treat poverty like a personality trait and not a systemic failure. This is what happens when we define dignity by a number on a spreadsheet. Her next words came with the weight of an entire community behind them. Who here, who in this room, believes that $60 makes May Turner rich? No one answered. They didn't need to, because in that moment everyone already knew. The silence was the confession. The silence following Jasmine Crockett's question still hung in the air like gunpowder smoke, undisturbed, unresolved, and undeniable. But then, with a stiffness that betrayed no emotion, Katie Britt slowly rose to her feet. Her eyes didn't flinch. Her posture was erect, disciplined, deliberate, as though she'd spent her entire life preparing for rooms just like this. Marble-lined, high-ceilinged, and split between empathy and disdain. With both hands planted firmly on the wooden table in front of her, she drew in a breath and spoke with a calm that almost sounded noble, until you listened closer. "We didn't come here to attack the poor," she began, her voice smooth but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "But if we won't say the truth in this room, then where will we say it?" A few nods from her side of the aisle followed. Encouragement. Permission. She turned slightly, glancing toward the gallery, and then aimed her next words not at Jasmine Crockett, but at every camera broadcasting live. What we're seeing is not compassion gone wrong. It's incentive gone toxic. It's a system that tells people, no matter how hard you work, someone who doesn't will get more. She let the sentence breathe for half a beat, just long enough to hang like a threat. Then she pivoted to her story. "I want to bring this closer to home," she said, gesturing toward the projection screen. "Two families, same zip code, same school district, 5 blocks apart in Mobile, Alabama." The screen lit up with 2 case files, anonymized but paired side by side. Family a father of 3. He works 42 hours a week at a local gas station. Nights he drives a delivery van for an independent contractor. His wife babysits part-time when she can. They file their taxes, they obey the law, they applied for benefits, Medicaid, housing assistance, SNAP, and were denied. Why? Because they make just over the threshold. Not enough to live, just enough to be excluded. Her tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. The silence in the room amplified every word. She turned to the second file. Family B, no employment history for the past 5 years. The mother receives full housing subsidy, SNAP benefits, and utility assistance. 3 meals a day come from federal aid. Her rent, paid. Her health care, covered. Then Katie looked up, her voice dropping to something quieter, colder. She doesn't work, doesn't apply, and there is no penalty, not even a question. She shut the folder in front of her with a firm, deliberate snap. "So, you tell me," she said, her gaze sweeping across the panel. "What message does that send to the father working 2 jobs just to stay behind?" She paused, perfectly timed, perfectly still, allowing the weight of her argument to settle like a stone on everyone's chest. When the system offers more to those who do less, it doesn't just fail the taxpayers. It betrays the very dignity of labor itself. There it was, her kill shot, dignity. A word that sounded noble, but here, wielded like a blade. From across the room, Jasmine didn't move, but her pulse didn't have to spike for her to feel the temperature change. She recognized the tactic. Pit pain against pain. Tell one person's struggle by erasing another's. Hold up a contrast, ignore the context, and let that false equivalence become a weapon of policy. But Jasmine said nothing. Not yet, because Britt had made one critical error. She had assumed that the absence of work meant the absence of worth. And Jasmine Crockett knew exactly how to answer that mistake, with fire. But first she let Britt's story echo, because soon she would make the room hear a very different kind of truth. The words had barely left Katie Britt's mouth when Jasmine Crockett rose. Not out of reflex, but purpose. The room had felt the chill of Britt's carefully curated contrast, but now it was about to feel heat. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The power in her tone came not from volume, but from restraint, from knowing exactly what it meant to carry the weight of the voiceless. She stepped forward with the deliberate control of someone who had spent a lifetime hearing her people reduced to footnotes in a budget debate. "Let's be honest," she began, her voice steady, almost quiet, like thunder before it hits. "Welfare isn't a reward. It's not a gold star. It's not a paycheck for laziness." She paused, making sure every word hit like a gavel. "It's a life vest, something you hand to someone after you've already pushed them out of the boat and then turned around and asked why they can't swim." Her hands were still, her spine straight. Her eyes scanned the room like a witness delivering testimony at a trial where the guilty sat in judgment. "You want to talk about incentives? Let's talk about survival." With a slow, almost reverent motion, she reached down and retrieved a folder, slimmer than the one that held Mrs. Turner's story, but no less potent. She opened it, pulled out a single photograph, and held it aloft. No projector. No digital enhancement. Just raw truth printed on paper. It was the image of a little girl, no more than 6 years old, sitting on the worn linoleum floor of a food pantry. Her knees were drawn to her chest. A plastic bowl sat in front of her with a spoon too big for her tiny hand. Her hair was pulled back in a crooked ponytail, and her eyes, wide, sunken, unblinking, stared straight into the camera, not with fear, but with exhaustion, the kind of look a child should never have to wear. "This," Jasmine said, holding the photo higher so the gallery could see, "is Marisol." She turned to the committee. "Her mother works sporadically, 2 nights a week at a diner when she can find someone to watch her. There's no fixed income, no daycare, no support system." She paused again, then added quietly, "No father. He died in detention, waiting on a hearing that never came." The air shifted. Even the cameras seemed to lean in closer. "This picture was taken at 6:42 a.m., Jasmine continued, her voice now razor sharp, "because that's when the community pantry opens, and if you wait until 7:15, the oatmeal's gone. The volunteers know her by name, not because it's charming, but because she's been there 3 times this week." She let the silence stretch, then lowered the photo and placed it gently on the table in front of her. Her next words came with no dramatic pause, just precision. "Is this what you call stagnation?" She turned fully to Britt now, not with fury, but with the unshakable presence of someone who no longer cared about civility when justice was bleeding. "Is this the child you're talking about when you say the system rewards idleness? When you show graphs and ratios and anonymous files? Is this who you mean? Because she's not a dependency statistic. She's a 6-year-old, and the only thing she depends on is the kindness of strangers who don't carry a government title." Her voice dipped lower, not softer, heavier. "She doesn't need discipline. She needs breakfast." Jasmine held still for a breath, letting her words do what numbers never could. "So I ask you all, every person sitting in this room, look at her and tell me, is she what you mean when you say the system's broken?" Her eyes swept the room once more. "Or is the system broken because a child like this needs charity to eat, while we argue whether her mother deserves to live?" She stepped back, the silence around her thick and absolute. No one moved, no one dared, because in that moment, Jasmine Crockett hadn't given a speech. She had broken the frame. She had taken a weapon aimed at the poor and turned it around, slow, deliberate, and undeniable, and aimed it right back at the hands that had thrown it. The room was still holding its breath from the image of Marisol, the 6-year-old girl surviving on donated oatmeal. But Jasmine knew pity alone wouldn't change a system built on polished lies. So she reached for something colder than sympathy. Proof. With slow precision, Jasmine pulled a thick, charcoal-colored folder from beneath her stack of constituent letters. She didn't slam it on the table. She didn't raise her voice. But the weight of that folder and what it contained shifted the room like the drop in air pressure before a coming storm. She held it up to the microphone with both hands and announced, "I respectfully request to submit a document most of you in this room have never read, and I suspect many of you hope no one ever would." The title was printed in blunt serif, GAO Audit, Fiscal Disbursements to Fortune 500 Entities, FY 2023. The screen behind her lit up. A slow-loading PDF opened in real time, as if even the technology knew what was coming next would hurt. 20 company logos appeared in rows. Amazon, Walmart, Chevron, Pfizer, Lockheed Martin, FedEx, Tyson Foods, and more, each accompanied by a number in bold red font. Jasmine didn't blink. These are the beneficiaries of what I call America's real welfare system, and it has nothing to do with food stamps or Medicaid. She paused, then continued, her tone like a lit fuse. These companies, the top 20, received over $1.2 billion in federal tax breaks and subsidies last year alone. She began to walk slowly toward the center of the hearing room, heels echoing across the polished wood. Let's break that down. Walmart, America's largest private employer, a company worth hundreds of billions. Their workers earn so little that over 300,000 of them qualify for public assistance just to feed their families. So the government, you and me, steps in with food stamps, Medicaid, and housing aid, not for the workers' sake, but because Walmart refuses to pay a living wage. Click. Next slide. A map appeared showing red dots across the U.S. Government supplemented wages for Amazon warehouse workers. In just 1 year, she said, Amazon operations triggered $221 million in public subsidies, not for innovation, but for cleanup. To cover what they won't. The room remained silent, cameras now whirring in overdrive, tracking her like a trial's closing argument. She turned her body, not facing the screen anymore, but the senators themselves. And let me be crystal clear, these aren't investments. These aren't emergency measures. These are systemic structures, built into the very architecture of our economy, designed to reward corporate giants while shaming working-class parents for needing help. She took a step closer to the bench where Britt sat, her expression unreadable. Jasmine's voice dropped lower now, almost conversational but with a sharp edge. So I asked this committee, and especially Senator Britt, why is it that when a black mother in Alabama asked for $200 to feed her child, she's called a parasite? But when Walmart lets the taxpayer fund its payroll, that's fiscal efficiency? She clicked again. A bar chart exploded onto the screen like a crime scene photo. At the top, corporate tax avoidance. 2023, $1.27 billion. Underneath, federal aid to low-income families. $138 million. Jasmine gestured at it with her open hand. We spend almost 10 times more supporting companies who exploit their own workers than we do helping the people actually suffering. Another beat passed. No one moved. Now her tone sharpened. We shame poor families for needing food. We force them to document every dollar, prove every purchase, explain every mistake. But when billion-dollar companies take our money, we call that business as usual. We let them write off private jets and union-busting lawyers, and no one blinks. She lifted the folder again, slowly this time, and let it rest open on the table before her. This report contains line-item data. It shows which members of Congress approved what credit, which companies lobbied for what exemption, names, dates, signatures. She tapped it twice. So if anyone here wants to claim this is fiction, I'll wait. But be warned, every page in here has receipts. Now Jasmine turned her full body toward Britt. Her stare was not angry. It was surgical. Senator, she began, her voice calm but pulsing with power, you stood here and called a system broken because it helped a poor mother survive. But I want you to help me understand, why is she a drain while Amazon is called a driver of growth? Why is she told to take responsibility while the biggest companies in the world get away with begging the government to subsidize poverty wages they created? The tension in the room became unbearable, like an invisible wire pulled tight, ready to snap. And Jasmine, never breaking eye contact, delivered the final blow with devastating clarity. The truth is, we don't hate handouts. We just like to control who gets them. Then she let it hang. No follow-up, no apology. Just the truth, raw and burning in the open air. A mirror no one wanted to look into, but none could turn away from. The silence that followed wasn't confusion. It was guilt, cornered by facts. And Jasmine didn't need a gavel or a vote. In that moment, her words were the verdict. As Jasmine's words hung in the air like a slow-burning indictment, not just of policy but of perception, a hush gripped the chamber. Then across the room, Britt shifted forward, not to strike back, but to reach somewhere the numbers couldn't touch. She stood slowly, not with defiance this time, but with something more human, weariness dressed in discipline. Her hands gripped the wooden edge of the lectern, fingers tightening ever so slightly, as if bracing against a truth she hadn't planned to revisit. Her voice, when it finally came, didn't rise. It retreated, quiet, controlled, a small window into a life few in that room could picture. "My mother," she began, her gaze not on Jasmine now, but somewhere inward, "taught third grade in Wilcox County for 30 years. She used to bring home chalk on her clothes and worry in her eyes. My father worked in a steel plant until a beam snapped and crushed his spine. He never walked again." She paused, not for effect, but because she had to. "I was 12. The words weren't rehearsed. They stumbled out like they'd been waiting for permission. Her eyes scanned the hearing room again, no longer searching for political advantage, but perhaps searching for a little grace. "We lived in a double wide with plastic on the windows to keep out the cold. Dinner was canned spinach and powdered milk. I wore the same 2 pairs of jeans all through high school, patching them myself when they tore." A short laugh escaped, bitter, nostalgic. "People talk about growing up hard. We grew up with borrowed light bulbs and quiet prayers." Her shoulders rose and fell with a breath that tried to stay composed. "But we didn't ask for help, not because we were proud. Lord knows we were desperate, but because we believed in the promise that if we worked hard, really hard, we could claw our way out. And eventually we did." Katie's voice firmed as she stepped slightly forward, no longer buried in memory, but rising out of it. "That struggle made me who I am, and I thank God we didn't rely on the government, because it forced me to believe in my own strength, not someone else's permission." The room was silent. No murmurs, no shuffling papers, just the weight of 2 lives now laid bare. Jasmine's defense of systemic victims and Katie's testimony of personal triumph. They weren't just debating policies anymore. They were wrestling with America's soul. "I say this not to dismiss anyone's pain," Katie added, glancing toward Jasmine, but not with spite, "but because I don't want us to build a system where survival is easier than success, where dependency becomes culture, not crisis." Her words didn't land with the force of accusation, but with the ache of experience. The kind of experience that carves a person into something sharp, and sometimes into something blind. There was a ripple of applause, restrained, respectful, not thunderous but genuine. A few nodded along, hands folded, yet others remained completely still, their eyes trained on Jasmine Crockett, waiting. Not because they disrespected Katie's story, but because they sensed it had just become one half of a much larger truth. And as the camera panned across the chamber, what it captured wasn't outrage or unity, but something more fragile and more dangerous. 2 Americas, both wounded, both real, and both unable, in this moment, to look away from each other. Katie's personal testimony had earned its moment of pause, but Jasmine Crockett understood something deeper. Empathy without action was theater, and sometimes a statistic needed a human face. She had come prepared to show one. Jasmine stood without ceremony, the silence around her thick like a storm about to break. "Mr. Chairman," she said, her voice level, "I request permission to bring forward a witness, someone whose life is not a hypothetical, but a consequence." She motioned toward the rear door. The audience turned, a ripple of curiosity cutting across rows of polished suits and stony expressions. The doors opened. In stepped a man whose presence didn't demand attention, until the pain etched into his posture made it impossible to ignore. Mid-50s, lean, weathered like rusted steel, Daniel Reyes walked with a slight limp, holding a folded cap in both hands like he was afraid to crush it, or maybe like it was the last thing he owned that hadn't betrayed him. Jasmine moved to his side as he took the witness seat. "This is Daniel Reyes," she began. "He worked at the General Motors plant in Lordstown, Ohio for 27 years. He didn't leave that job. He was abandoned by it. When the plant closed, so did his health insurance, his financial security, and his peace of mind." Daniel cleared his throat. His voice cracked on the first word. "I've never spoken in a room like this. Usually I'm under the hood of a car, not under the lights." He glanced nervously at the cameras. "I built engines, real ones. Worked every shift I was given. Paid into the system, voted. Never asked for more than I gave." He paused, gathering something heavier than his thoughts. "Then the cancer hit. Liver, stage 3. Doctors said it wasn't from drinking, said it was probably from chemical exposure at the plant. I applied for Medicaid after my insurance ran out. I couldn't afford the treatments otherwise." His hands tightened around the cap. "They denied me, said I had too much." A low stir moved through the room. Jasmine nodded for him to continue. Daniel unfolded a single page from his jacket. It shook in his fingers. "This is the letter. Denial of benefits. The reason's right here." Jasmine took it gently, and with a click, the page appeared projected behind them. A red underline cut through the line like a wound. "Assets exceed allowable threshold." Beneath it, 1998 Chevrolet Lumina. Estimated value, $1,195. Daniel's voice grew quieter, but somehow heavier. "That car, it's how I get to the clinic. It's how I take my wife to her job cleaning floors at the nursing home. They told me to sell it. If I did, we couldn't get to work. I couldn't get to treatment. But they said keeping it made me ineligible." The room, already cold, seemed to freeze. Every word added weight to the silence. "I didn't ask for charity. I asked for help so I could keep working, so I could stay alive. And they said no, because I owned a 25-year-old car." His voice caught. "What kind of system values a dying man's engine more than his body?" Cameras flashed, shutters clicking like gunshots against the stillness. A staffer covered her mouth. Someone in the back muttered, "Jesus," but no one spoke over him. Jasmine stepped forward, now holding the projected letter in her hand. "Let this enter into the official record," she said, voice tight. "This is what disqualification looks like. Not laziness, not fraud. Just an old car and a man who tried to hold on to a little dignity." She turned toward the committee members, but her eyes found Katie Britt. "Senator, earlier you spoke of your childhood, of canned beans and broken windows. You survived hardship and took pride in not needing assistance. I respect that." Jasmine's voice dropped, steady and precise. "But let me ask you, if your father's wheelchair was counted as an asset, if your mother's chalkboard disqualified her from food stamps, would you still believe the system was built to help the righteous and punish the idle?" No answer came. Jasmine wasn't waiting for one. She turned back to Daniel, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You shouldn't be here begging for compassion. You should be home, resting, healing, living whatever life this country still owes you." Daniel nodded, but his face was unreadable, tired, not from the disease, but from the policies that treated it like a transaction. Jasmine raised her voice slightly, enough to shake the walls without shouting. "We say we honor workers, that we value families, that no one should have to choose between medicine and transportation, between dignity and eligibility. But this document says otherwise. This is the fine print of injustice." The room had gone fully still. No papers rustled, no aides whispered. Every pair of eyes was locked either on the man in the witness chair or on the quiet fury building in the congresswoman beside him. Jasmine leaned forward, placing the denial letter on the table as if it were evidence in a criminal trial. "If anyone here believes that a man with cancer should sell the car that keeps his wife employed just to qualify for basic care, say so. Now." No one did, And in that silence, Daniel Reyes sat surrounded by lawmakers, cameras, and microphones. Yet he had never felt more invisible, until Jasmine Crockett made sure the whole nation saw him. And they did. The room had already felt the weight of suffering through Daniel Reyes's trembling voice. But Jasmine Crockett knew one final blade needed to fall, not from a broken man, but from the lips of the powerful when they thought no one was listening. She didn't rise this time. She didn't have to. Jasmine Crockett's hand moved with surgical precision as she reached into a slim folder and retrieved a small, unmarked flash drive. She placed it on the table like a live grenade. "Mr. Chairman," she said calmly, though every word pulsed with restrained fire, "before we close this hearing, I ask the committee to listen to a brief internal audio recording obtained under whistleblower protections. This is not public testimony. This is private strategy." There was a pause. Murmurs flickered across the chamber like shadows from a passing storm. The chair nodded. A technician accepted the drive, plugged it into the system, and without any fanfare, the voice began. It wasn't the tone of a politician. It was cleaner, smoother, the kind of voice that spends more time in boardrooms than on ballots. "We've run the numbers," the voice said, measured and confident. "When benefit levels rise above certain thresholds, labor force participation drops. People wait longer to take jobs. They negotiate harder. That makes lower-tier employers less competitive. So yes, we recommend tightening benefit eligibility to reinforce labor elasticity." The words were bloodless, but the next sentence hit like a whip crack. "If the poor aren't hurting, they won't work. Pain is an economic lever." A ripple passed through the audience, almost imperceptible. But Jasmine felt it, the slow, dawning horror. One congressman's pen dropped and clattered to the floor. A few aides exchanged glances, unsure whether to keep typing or simply sit in the moment. Jasmine rose, slowly, deliberately. Her hands were calm, but her gaze was fire. She looked not at the chairman, not at the cameras, but directly at Katie Britt. "That wasn't a lobbyist," she said, voice clear as a knife slicing through smoke. "That wasn't a political enemy. That was one of our own federal advisors, paid with your tax dollars, sitting in a room, behind closed doors, deciding how much suffering is economically efficient." The room remained silent, yet everything felt louder. The breath of the staffer 2 rows behind, the hum of fluorescent lights, the recording still frozen on the screen behind her. Jasmine stepped forward toward the witness table, then turned back to face the full chamber. "This isn't about fraud," she said. "This isn't about lazy people gaming the system. This is about a cold, calculated philosophy that says unless people are desperate, they're useless to the economy. That hunger creates obedience. That suffering is strategy." She walked over to the screen and pointed at the transcript, now projected in bold type. "Pain is an economic lever. That," she said, voice trembling, not with weakness, but with tightly coiled rage, "is not economics. That is moral rot. It is cruelty with a diploma." Katie Britt remained still. Her hands, once folded tightly in front of her, now trembled ever so slightly on the desk. She didn't look up. Whether it was guilt or just the realization that the curtain had been yanked back too far, too fast, no one could say. Jasmine returned to the microphone, her voice now quieter. But in that quiet was something lethal. "We call them benefits, but what they are lifelines. And now you've heard it from the architects. Not only do they withhold them, they weaponize the withholding. They create policies that punish people for surviving, and they justify it by pretending it's a meritocracy." She paused. Her next words came slowly, as if each syllable had to be pulled through centuries of injustice. "This is not policy. This is not fiscal responsibility. This is budgetary torture." The sentence fell like a gavel slamming down, not from the chairman's hand, but from a reckoning far larger. A cameraman coughed, but even the sound seemed distant. No one else moved. No one dared to, because Jasmine hadn't just exposed a broken system. She had exposed the intent behind it, the ideology that made it broken by design. And in that silence, Jasmine Crockett didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply stood still in the eye of the storm she had summoned, while the rest of the room wrestled with the truth they could no longer unhear. The budget had always been a battlefield, but now the weapons had names, and Jasmine had just forced them all into the light. The chamber remained heavy with the weight of revelations. Jasmine's words had pierced the veneer of policy debates, exposing the raw nerves of a system fraught with inequity. Now all eyes turned to Senator Katie Britt, awaiting her response. Senator Katie Britt sat motionless, her hands clasped tightly on the desk before her. The silence stretched, each second amplifying the tension in the room. She inhaled deeply, her shoulders rising as she summoned the strength to speak. Her gaze, once steely and unyielding, now reflected a storm of emotions, conflict, realization, and a hint of vulnerability. "I came into this chamber with convictions," she began, her voice steady but subdued. "Beliefs forged from personal experience, from a life where hard work was the currency of survival." She paused, her eyes scanning the faces before her. "My mother was a teacher. My father, after his accident, could no longer provide. We lived modestly, relying on canned goods in the hope that tomorrow would be kinder." She leaned forward slightly, her hands unfolding as if releasing a burden. "I believe that resilience was the antidote to hardship, that government assistance, while necessary, should be a temporary bridge, not a permanent crutch." Her voice faltered for a moment, the weight of the previous testimonies pressing upon her. "But today," she continued, her tone tinged with introspection, "I've been confronted with narratives that challenge that belief. Stories of individuals who, despite their best efforts, find themselves ensnared in a system that seems more punitive than supportive." She glanced at Jasmine, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. "I want to believe that our system can be both robust and compassionate," she said, her voice gaining strength. "But perhaps today I've glimpsed its harsher realities." She concluded, her words hanging in the air, a testament to a mind in transition. The room remained silent, the gravity of her admission settling over the assembly. Jasmine Crockett, seated across from her, did not applaud nor smile. Instead, she inclined her head slightly, her expression solemn. "Sometimes," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of truth, "a nation doesn't need more money. It needs more heart." The chamber held its breath, the exchange between the two women transcending political lines, touching the core of shared humanity. The chamber remained heavy with the weight of revelations. Jasmine's words had pierced the veneer of policy debates, exposing the raw nerves of a system fraught with inequity. Now all eyes turned to Senator Katie Britt, awaiting her response. Senator Katie Britt sat motionless, her hands clasped tightly on the desk before her. The silence stretched, each second amplifying the tension in the room. She inhaled deeply, her shoulders rising as she summoned the strength to speak. Her gaze, once steely and unyielding, now reflected a storm of emotions, conflict, realization, and a hint of vulnerability. "I came into this chamber with convictions," she began, her voice steady but subdued. "Beliefs forged from personal experience, from a life where hard work was the currency of survival." She paused, her eyes scanning the faces before her. "My mother was a teacher. My father, after his accident, could no longer provide. We lived modestly, relying on canned goods in the hope that tomorrow would be kinder." She leaned forward slightly, her hands unfolding as if releasing a burden. "I believe that resilience was the antidote to hardship, that government assistance, while necessary, should be a temporary bridge, not a permanent crutch." Her voice faltered for a moment, the weight of the previous testimonies pressing upon her. "But today," she continued, her tone tinged with introspection, "I've been confronted with narratives that challenge that belief. Stories of individuals who, despite their best efforts, find themselves ensnared in a system that seems more punitive than supportive." She glanced at Jasmine, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. "I want to believe that our system can be both robust and compassionate," she said, her voice gaining strength. "But perhaps today I've glimpsed its harsher realities." She concluded, her words hanging in the air, a testament to a mind in transition. The room remained silent, the gravity of her admission settling over the assembly. Jasmine Crockett, seated across from her, did not applaud nor smile. Instead, she inclined her head slightly, her expression solemn. "Sometimes," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of truth, A nation doesn't need more money. It needs more heart. The chamber held its breath, the exchange between the two women transcending political lines, touching the core of shared humanity. The hush that followed the hearing's adjournment still clung to the marble walls like an aftershock, and as the final echo of gavels faded into hushed whispers, Jasmine Crockett pushed through the heavy bronze doors, carrying with her the unseen weight of testimony, exposed cruelty, and the faintest hum of possibility, the kind of atmosphere that makes even the drizzle outside feel electric with consequence, so that the moment she stepped beneath the Capitol portico, the gray sky seemed to bow, unleashing a soft, needling rain that fluttered against her coat and turned every stone step into a mirror for the lights behind her. Cameras sprang to life beneath a canopy of umbrellas, their red tally lamps blinking like warning beacons amid the downpour, and reporters jostled for position, heels scraping wet granite, microphones thrust forward through the curtain of water, while aides scrambled to keep folders dry. All of them hungry for one last sound bite to frame the chaotic artistry of the day's revelations, the numbers, the tears, the stunned silence in which an entire committee had realized the ledger of American morality was written in red ink. A young journalist in a rumpled Navy suit managed to wedge himself to the front, rain streaking down his glasses, voice quivering with a mixture of ambition and genuine urgency, and his question sliced through the patter of water on nylon. Congresswoman, if the bill stalls, if the Senate buries it in committee, if the votes vanish the way so many promises have, what then? What do you say to people who believe today might finally change something? Jasmine paused mid-stride, the glow of a street lamp cutting a pale halo around the steam rising from the Capitol grounds. And for a heartbeat, she let the storm speak. The hiss of tires on slick asphalt, the distant clap of thunder, the fragile chorus of protesters still camped beyond the barricades, while inside her chest the day rewound in jagged flashes. Daniel Reyes clutching a denial letter, May Turner counting pills she could not afford, a room full of lawmakers blinking away the sting of an inconvenient truth they could no longer unsee. She pivoted slowly, rain tracing silver rivulets along the contours of her cheeks, meeting the reporter's eyes with a gaze tempered by resolve and fatigue, a gaze that held both the fire of righteous anger and the steadiness of a surgeon's hand. And she understood in that instant that her answer would be carried far beyond this curb, into living rooms and break rooms and overnight shifts where faith in government had been starved for decades. Her voice, when it emerged, did not soar or tremble. It rolled out low and certain, each syllable honed by countless town hall nights and courthouse mornings. I don't write legislation to chase polling numbers, she said, the words cutting through the rain like a clean blade. I draft these pages so that the next Daniel, the next May, the next child wondering where dinner will come from, will not have to bargain with their dignity just to stay alive. The line struck with a physical force. Microphones tilted forward, camera shutters fluttered like startled birds, and social media feeds all over the city lit up as if someone had flipped a switch. Yet Jasmine scarcely noticed the frenzy because she saw something else ignite. A flicker of surprise in the reporter's expression, the silent gratitude of an older nurse at the barricade clutching a handmade sign, the quick nod of a freshman congresswoman who had listened from the doorway and realized politics could still sound like humanity. Turning away, Jasmine descended the Capitol steps, shoes splashing in shallow puddles that reflected the dome, now shimmering beneath rain-blurred floodlights. And each footfall felt like planting a flag on a battlefield where victories are measured less by headlines than by smaller, harder arithmetic. The prescription filled, the eviction stayed, the job that finally pays for both rent and breakfast. Yet tonight, even the weight of failure could not crush the fierceness of that mathematics, because every droplet soaking her coat was a reminder that seeds do not bloom beneath clear skies. They need storms. Behind her, the reporter scrambled to file his clip. Staffers debated damage control. Lobbyists refreshed spreadsheets. But none of their murmurings could drown the murmur now spreading through the crowd. An almost imperceptible rhythm, part hope, part defiance, like the first dangerous beat of a march swelling in the darkness. Because something in the cadence of Jasmine's promise had pierced the cynicism that usually shields the powerful, and people who had come to expect little from Congress suddenly felt the stir of a different expectation, that perhaps conscience could be coaxed into policy. On the sidewalk, she paused beneath a lone magnolia, its blossoms bruised by rain yet still fragrant, and she looked back one last time at the pillars where arguments had collided with truths, at the cameras still hunting for spectacle, then lifted her chin into the drizzle. In the hush that followed, her closing words lingered like an ember against the chill night air. No campaign slogan, no partisan flourish, simply a credo forged in witness. "We don't need a richer ledger," she whispered to herself, the rain swallowing her voice yet carrying its spirit outward. "We need a country where balance is measured by mercy." The rain-streaked steps behind her disappeared into night, yet every silver droplet on Jasmine's coat kept whispering the same question. What lasting human lesson can survive the storm of politics? The first lesson begins with scale, with the realization that a single denial letter or a single empty lunchbox is never isolated. Each is a tremor in a larger seismic field of neglect. And once you feel those vibrations, you cannot pretend the fault line is someone else's problem. You learn that spreadsheets lie by omission, that averages conceal agony, and that entire communities can be rendered invisible by the placement of a decimal. The moral terrain tilts beneath your feet when you understand how quickly dignity can be repossessed, how easily a 20-year-old sedan becomes an unacceptable luxury, and how effortlessly a child's hunger is rebranded as parental failure. Jasmine's journey teaches that moral arithmetic is ruthless when performed by those who will never pay the interest on deprivation. She shows that the distance between comfort and collapse can be bridged by something as trivial as a worn-out timing belt or a medical code on the wrong line of a form. The human lesson, then, is that fragility is universal even when suffering is not evenly distributed, and any policy built on the assumption of unbreakable citizens is a blueprint for societal fracture. It is here that the injustice hits hardest, because the people drafting the rules are protected by benefits no application can deny, and by safety nets stitched from influence rather than thread. The lesson crystallizes: systems favor those already standing on marble floors, while blaming those forced to tread water for not climbing fast enough. A second lesson arrives in the hush after the cameras cut, when the echo of testimony reverberates through hallways that smell of waxed stone and old ambition, and Jasmine's footsteps teach that silence is not the absence of sound, but the presence of choice. When legislators fall quiet, that hush can signal reckoning or retreat, and it is the citizen's task to decide which. The scene where Daniel's voice cracked is now replayed in break rooms and late-night radio, and every listener is invited to measure the gap between his decades of labor and the system's clinical disregard. That gulf is the birthplace of empathy, but empathy without motion decays into voyeurism. So the real instruction is to turn witness into will. Jasmine's unflinching stance before wealth-forged power reminds any bystander that emotional courage often begins where political convenience ends. It is a call to expose the distance between the rhetoric of merit and the reality of rigged ladders, a demand to count the hands reaching upward rather than the dollars trickling down. Her persistence reveals that true representation is less about echoing a district's demographics and more about echoing its unspoken dread of being written off the national ledger. She proves a single uncompromised voice can flood a soundproof room, and that lesson is both invitation and warning. Speak or be measured only by the silence you allow. The third human lesson is carved from the clash of personal narrative versus institutional narrative, illustrated when Katie's childhood of canned beans was laid beside May Turner's pharmacy receipt, and suddenly adversity stopped being a badge of honor and became a continuum of hazard. It shows that two truths can coexist while canceling no pain. One woman climbed without aid, another is being buried by a ladder of paperwork, and both stories demand different remedies. Jasmine forces the nation to admit that bootstrap myths become weapons when wielded against those whose boots were repossessed. The moral takeaway is that anecdotes can illuminate but never exonerate. A single escape from poverty cannot justify building higher walls around the exit. Justice requires systems that flex for the fragile instead of fortifying the fortunate, and policies must be drafted not to punish hardship, but to outpace it. This lesson pulses through every gasping pause of the hearing. Personal grit is heroic, systemic grit is barbaric. To honor resilience, one must first remove the grindstone, or else applause becomes complicity. Jasmine's stare across the aisle teaches that empathy divorced from policy is a sermon to a locked church. The injustice she confronts is that survivors are applauded on stages built from the planks of those still drowning. A fourth lesson thrums in the low vocals of that leaked recording, where a faceless strategist describes suffering as an economic lever, revealing that cruelty can be coded into guidelines more subtly than any slur, and yet cut deeper. The immediate human insight is that sanitized language often conceals lethal intent. Bureaucratic diction can starve as effectively as overt malice. That moment exposes how moral injury is inflicted not only with hateful speech, but with neutral memos stipulating cost containment. By playing that clip, Jasmine taught an advanced course in ethical translation. Convert the cold calculus back into the body heat it extinguishes. The lesson urges citizens to interrogate every euphemism: labor elasticity, market discipline, asset threshold, because behind each phrase may sit an unacknowledged corpse of opportunity. The cinematic tension here is the revelation that villains do not always twirl mustaches. Sometimes they balance budgets. Jasmine's quiet condemnation, budgetary torture, is a line that should reverberate through every fiscal meeting henceforth, a moral watermark against which all future policies must be held. The injustice at stake is slow violence, bloodless yet relentless, and her lesson is that ignoring it is a partisan luxury humanity cannot afford. A fifth lesson emerges in the collective response, when over 1,200 nurses and teachers sign their names beneath a letter that reads like a battlefield triage report for democracy. We see the need daily. People need rescuing, not vetting. Their signatures transform individual outrage into communal force, proving solidarity is not a hashtag but a muscle that must be exercised under stress. The nurses know the pulse of desperation better than any economist. The teachers can trace poverty's graph in the lunchroom lines long before it appears in quarterly data. Their chorus teaches that policy expertise without frontline testimony is a blunt instrument, and frontline testimony without policy follow-through is a lullaby for the comfortable. When their letter floods inboxes on the Hill, it becomes a diagnostic chart for the body politic, showing precisely where compassion is hemorrhaging. That convergence of professions, caregivers of body and mind, signals a new metric of national health: whether children can learn without hunger pains, whether patients can heal without bankruptcy. Jasmine's struggle reached them not because it was sensational, but because it was familiar. And the lesson is that familiarity with injustice must become a catalyst, not a sedative. The injustice here is that those who understand necessity best are often granted the least authority to define it. A sixth lesson surfaces in the rain itself, that cinematic drizzle enveloping Jasmine as she descends the stairs, illustrating that aftermaths are rarely triumphant. They are damp, heavy, and unresolved. The droplets ticking against her umbrella echo the ticking of legislative clocks, and each whisper reminds her that momentum dies quickly in dry rooms. Yet the drizzle also baptizes the promise, washing away the dust of committee stalls, allowing seeds of outrage to sink into fertile soil. The lesson lies in motion. Justice requires walking into storms rather than waiting for clear skies. By pausing to answer the reporter, Jasmine performs another act of teaching. Courage is quieter than applause and louder than surrender. Her refusal to package her fight as a campaign slogan signals that authenticity is the last untarnished currency in an over-leveraged democracy. The injustice she faces is the inertia waiting to congeal once cameras power down. Her remedy is to keep citizens' pulse rates elevated long enough to outlive that inertia. She shows that every raindrop on her coat is a fast-fading headline unless it lands on kindling hearts. The seventh and final lesson is embedded in her reply, 9 words that ricochet across airwaves. I don't write laws to win votes. I write them so people don't lose at life. This line reframes legislative purpose from a scoreboard to a lifeline, charging every future bill with the obligation to redistribute not just resources, but risk. The lesson insists that the success of a nation is measured not by GDP, but by the gap between catastrophe and recovery for its most vulnerable. Its cinematic force lies in its universality. Any viewer, regardless of party, can imagine a sudden fall, an illness, a layoff, a flood, and understand that the ground they land on is poured by policy. Jasmine converts that anxiety into agency, turning fear of loss into fuel for change, and that transformation is the highest art of leadership. She demonstrates that injustice thrives in the space where empathy evaporates, and the antidote is legislation infused with lived reality. Her closing words convert moral witness into marching orders. Draft laws as if your own heartbeat depends on them. The injustice she challenges is complacency. The lesson she leaves is vigilance. And as she walks into the rain-washed night, her silhouette becomes less a lone figure than the first line of a human ledger, finely balanced in favor of mercy rather than margin. Yet if the lessons carved into that storm-lit hearing are to matter beyond the Capitol steps, they must detonate into movement. So hear this call not as rhetoric, but as a flare. You who watch Daniel's fingers shake around a cancer denial letter. You who teach children whose stomachs drown out algebra. You whose stethoscope catches the hollow thud of unpaid fear. Step forward now, because the architects of complacency are counting on your exhaustion. Flood every congressional inbox with stories sharp enough to slice through boilerplate replies. Jam every phone line until aides hear a chorus of unpaid rent notices and unfilled prescriptions, and don't apologize for the volume. Polite desperation is a lobbyist's favorite lullaby, so make your demand loud enough to rattle the brass nameplates off committee doors. Print May Turner's $2,173 pharmacy bill on posters, tape them to town hall walls, and dare any lawmaker to walk past without signing a promise to fix it. Nurses wheel towers of redacted patient charts into the rotunda until case numbers eclipse the dome. Teachers unspool cafeteria debt ledgers across marble floors so the echo of every empty lunch tray reverberates under chandeliers bought with corporate tax breaks. When lobbyists slip through side entrances whispering about market efficiency, meet them with crowds brandishing flashlights and camera phones, turning their jargon into a public confession. Let every hallway where deals trade hands in the dark drown in daylight and witnesses. Turn the ballot box into a battleground where candidates must declare whether poverty is a policy choice or a natural disaster. And remember, silence on that question is an endorsement of the latter. Hijack the hashtags that sell sneakers and streaming shows, rename them after Medicaid rejection codes and eviction docket numbers, and prove that trending topics become torches when enough hands lift them. Tell every neighbor the national budget isn't a ledger, but a life support monitor. If the vital signs flatline, blame falls on anyone who looked away when the alarm first beeped. March right, donate, strike, and vote as though defending your own future hospital bed, your own child's report card, because in an economy that puts a price on compassion, the invoice will eventually reach every doorstep. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.